Hey guys, Mr. R here. Tomorrow you have your big test, your first test of the year for world history. And I'm going to go over a few things now so that you are prepared tomorrow and you can get an A on this test, no problem. So you'll remember the first thing we learned about was the Neolithic Revolution. We made those cool little posters that showed life before and after the Neolithic Revolution. What you need to remember about that is that it was a change from nomadic hunting and gathering to settled farming. So nomadic means that people moved around from place to place. After the Neolithic Revolution, they stopped doing that. They settled in one spot, started to build towns and cities and stuff like that. Along with the Neolithic Revolution, we had the discovery of farming, the domestication of animals, and family sizes also grew larger because more food was readily available. All right, let's get into our first civilizations. One thing that they all have in common is that they all developed in river valleys. So whether it is Egypt developing in the Nile, next to the Nile River, Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, India in the Indus River Valley, or China near the Yellow River, that's one thing that they all had in common. So if there's a question on the test that might ask about something that was in common between the early civilizations or between two early civilizations, river valleys. They all developed in river valleys. All right, let's move on. Let's get a little more specific here. So Mesopotamia. Do you remember Mesopotamia? That was a long time ago. Let's go over it quick. Mesopotamia was where the first civilizations developed. It was located between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They're famous for the ziggurats, which were the temples that they had in the center of their cities. Sumer was the name of the first major city-state in Mesopotamia. And probably the most famous guy to come from that time period was Hammurabi, the first guy to actually write down laws so that people could see it. All right, let's move on to Egypt. So what do we need to know about Egypt? Well, Egypt developed near the Nile River. We know that they had the pyramids, which were used as burial tombs for the pharaohs, the Egyptian kings, the rulers of Egypt. They were also very often robbed because pharaohs were buried with all their gold and all their wealth because they thought they could take it to the afterlife with them. Two of the famous rulers of Egypt that we learned about were King Tut. He was a pharaoh who died at about the age of 19, and it was believed to have happened because of a leg infection. And Cleopatra, who was a female ruler of Egypt. She had a lot to do with the Roman Empire and making alliances with them to gain power for herself. We'll talk more about the Romans later, though. Okay, let's move on. India. So India developed in the Indus River Valley. It is located on the subcontinent of India. Remember we talked about what a subcontinent was? It was a large piece of land that kind of extends down from a continent. So India is not a continent itself, it is a subcontinent. We talked about the monsoons in India, which were the seasonal winds, and depending on where they were coming from, either the sea or the mountains, they either brought very dry air that killed the crops or very rainy weather that allowed the crops to flourish and grow. So that kind of determined when India could grow their crops and when farmers could go out and harvest them and be able to feed their civilization. With India, we also talked about the Four Noble Truths and Eightfold Path, which had to do with Buddhism, which was founded by Siddhartha Gautama. He's the founder of Buddhism. We talked about Hinduism and how they believed in attaining the goal of reaching moksha. We talked about the caste system, which you remember was the social structure in India, and depending on where you were born, you were pretty much stuck there for the rest of your life. You could be a good person, you could study really hard and do well on all your tests in school, but you couldn't move out of your caste if you were born into a low caste. Wherever you were born, that was the social level that you stayed at for the rest of your life. All right, flying through this, we've got a few more things to touch on. China. With China, one of the important things to know is that one of the main things that they sold that made them very wealthy was silk, which was made from silkworms. There's actually a famous road called the Silk Road, which was a trade route from China to the Middle East and Europe. We also talked about the mandate of heaven, which I know a lot of people struggled with in class today. To refresh you on that, the mandate of heaven was basically what Chinese people believed that the rulers had, and that it was what gave them the right to rule. So the mandate of heaven was the idea that the rulers had the right to rule from the gods, that the gods were the ones that gave them the power to be the ruler, to be the leader. We also learned about Lao Tzu. Do you remember who he was? He was the founder of Taoism. And we had Confucius as well, who was the founder of Confucianism. Okay, moving on to Greece. We talked about Sparta versus Athens, the two major city-states. Sparta had a very strong military. Remember, the boys had to go into military service at 7 years of age and basically live at the barracks for a really long time. Athens was more about democracy, art, and education. One thing about Greece was their geography. They had a very mountainous geography and a lot of islands, which prevented them from having a lot of interactions with other cultures. We also talked about that with China. Remember, there was a similarity between the two. Greece and China, both of them had a lot of mountains, made it difficult to have a lot of contact with other civilizations at that time. Let's talk about key terms. So the first one I wanted to talk about was a dynasty. A dynasty is when one family rules over a country or a territory or a kingdom for a long period of time. It could be hundreds or even thousands of years. We also talked about the word domesticate. So that came up in the Neolithic Revolution. If you domesticate an animal, it means you tame that animal. So some examples of domesticated animals would be cows, pigs, chickens, and dogs. Monotheistic versus polytheistic. Monotheistic means that you believe in one God, while polytheistic means that you believe in many gods. A lot of the early civilizations that we learned about were polytheistic. They believed in many gods. Next, we will talk about monarchy. So monarchy was a rule by a king or a queen. And last, democracy. Democracy is when the people have a say in the government. Alright, that about does it for me. Thank you for watching. This is definitely going to help you out with the test tomorrow. Make sure to study, get a good night's sleep. Don't forget to do your vocab and turn that in. And good luck tomorrow. Take care.